Welcome, everyone, to an evening with Lois Lowry, as Mina mentioned, sponsored by the Friends of Cary Library. I am Ethie Slade. I'm the president of the Friends, and on behalf of the board and all of the Cary Friends, we are delighted that Lois and all of you could join us this evening. Lois was originally going to be at the library in person this evening, and we were so delighted and glad when she agreed to do a virtual visit. Aside from this being a virtual program, what is unique about this evening is that it is unusual in the Friends' 31-year history of helping to support adult and youth programs that a Friends-sponsored authors program brings multiple generations together at the same time, which speaks to Lois Lowry's appeal to so many people of all ages. For those of you in our audience who are members of the Friends, donate to the Friends, purchase books at our book sale and from our bookstores, thank you. It is the proceeds from these that bring programs like this to all of us. We greatly appreciate your past and your continuing support. And to tell you the truth, we are really looking forward to the day our bookstores can be reopened and our book sales can return. In a moment, I'm going to turn the program back over to Mina Jane to introduce Lois. But before that happens, Lois, I would like to take a minute to present you with a gift. We had a small gift that we had originally planned in-house this evening at the end of the program. So let me give you a little bit of a quick background about this gift. Many, if not all, of the people in our audience have read The Giver, and we all know that. And we also know that there have been many editions of it, along with the movie. Well, last year, The Giver was published as a graphic novel. At the end of the book, there is a question and answer discussion with Lois. She was asked if she read graphic novels and what was her favorite. She answered, "I certainly did when I was a kid, and we called them comic books." Her favorite was Little Lulu, about an amazing little girl. I can see it rings a bell. Anyways, we went on a comic book hunt, and lo and behold, and hopefully this is visible to you, we found
Yes, she is. Yes, my favorite. She was the first feminist.
Yeah, it's a 1967, and it may not be, the light might be getting in the way. It actually cost 12 cents. So
12 cents. I only paid a dime.
It was a later edition, maybe because it's a Clubhouse special. Anyways, we will arrange to send this on to you along with a couple of other things. So, but now I'd like to turn this back to Mina, who was instrumental in bringing this evening together and will officially introduce you. And so I thank all of you and enjoy the evening. Take it.
Thank you, Ethie. I really appreciate you helping us bring this program, like I said, to the Cary Library. So I think most people here know Lois Lowry, have been reading her for a long, long time. She, of course, is a Newbery Award-winning author of The Giver and Number the Stars from 1990 and 1994. And she has been writing for many, many years. But the thing that I really love about her is that she writes to everybody. She writes to children and teenagers and adults, and everybody can enjoy her stories and learn from them and reflect on them. And I think that that's why when we announced that Lois was going to be here, we had such excitement in our community over Lois coming to Lexington. And we are really, really thrilled to have you here. I do want to say that when we asked Lois to do this, she immediately said yes. She was going on an 8-city tour for her new book, On the Horizon, which is wonderful, by the way. And she said yes, even though it was a long week, a long few months, whatever. And we were really taken by that because she heard that we were promoting our Friends of the Library and the importance of Friends to the Library, which is just an essential part of what we do. And their support is incredibly meaningful to us. And for somebody like Lois to say, yes, I want to be there to support the Friends was incredible for us. And we really are thankful for you. And I'm going to just hand it over to you. I know you have a presentation, and then we will take questions after the session, after the presentation. So without further ado, here comes Lois. Lois, it's all on you.
I'm not seeing myself. There I am. Okay, all I saw was Cary Library. I was waiting for something to happen. And here I am. And I can't see any of you, but oddly, this feels like a very intimate setting. Maybe because we're all sitting in our living rooms or who knows where. And we all need haircuts, I'm sure. I know I do. And so it's great to be with you on this lovely evening. I'm in Maine. Somebody a few minutes ago asked me if I was in Hawaii. Goodness, I left Hawaii many years ago. I kind of wish I were there, but no, I'm at my home in Maine. I'm sitting in my dining room. You know how all the talking heads on TV position themselves in front of bookcases? And I suspect that they all carefully arrange their books, so you think that's what they're actually reading. Behind me, though, is a selection of my own books bound in leather, which have been gifts from publishers over the years. And next to them is St. Francis, whom I bought in Guatemala once. What I'm going to do is show you stuff, because I think it's more fun for you to look at things and pictures rather than just at me talking. So I'm going to click on the button that should allow me to do that. And there we are. It says now I'm screen sharing. And so there I am with my hair even more in need of a haircut. That was a couple of weeks ago that picture was taken. And I got to get a couple things out of the way first. I'm trying to figure out how to advance this. Oh, excuse me. This is one I'd forgotten. I just put this in this afternoon. A friend of mine in Cambridge, Massachusetts, emailed me this morning. She was out for a walk, and she took this picture, and it says, "Missing the library." And aren't we all? This is what I said I wanted to get out of the way, because people always want to know what new books are coming. And also the publisher would like you to mention new books because that's how they sell them. The Willoughbys on the left is a book I wrote some years ago. And this is a new cover on it because it's just come out as a Netflix movie. Amazingly, I've heard from Netflix that 34 million families have watched this movie. I guess that's because everybody's stuck at home with nothing to do. It's an animated film, and people are enjoying it. I like the book better, but that's because I wrote the book. And I think generally a book is always going to be a little better than the movie. Nonetheless, with all those people watching the Willoughbys, the publisher asked me a few months ago if I would write a sequel. You can see that this is advanced reading copy, not for sale. So you're getting a sneak peek of the Willoughbys' return. At the end of the first book, the parents of the Willoughby children, who are incidentally terrible parents. So we're not sad to know that at the end of the first book, they are frozen solid on an Alp. They've had a misbegotten vacation in Switzerland, and they wore Birkenstocks and Bermuda shorts climbing the Matterhorn, and they froze to death. And it says they're like popsicles up there, and they have smiles on their faces. The end. Okay, what to do? For a second book, I made it 30 years later, and global warming has melted the Alps, and the book begins with the Willoughby parents emerging from the snow, defrosted, still just as obnoxious as they'd always been. But the interesting thing is that they're still the same age they were when they froze. And so they make their way home to find the children, whom they never liked very much anyway, and they discover that they are now younger than their children. So that propels the plot of the Willoughbys' return. Two other books, actually one book with two different covers. This is a book I wrote 10 years ago, set in Portland, Maine in 1918. And when the publisher realized recently that it's set during the flu epidemic of 1918, they have republished it with, as you can see, a special new introduction from the author and a new cover and a little a bit of information that was not on the first book. And it says, when the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 strikes. And I can't read the rest because something is on top of it, the names of the people at this event. But at any rate, it's called Like the Willow Tree. And as you can see, the young girl, 11 years old in the book, orphaned by the flu epidemic. And you can see she's wearing a mask, as are the people in the background, as they did in 1918 and as I did this afternoon in Portland, Maine. Okay, these are my own children. This is back in 1968. My kids grew up in Maine. I married very young, dropped out of college when I was 19, got married, had 4 children before I was 26. And at this point, well, how old would they have been? 10, 11, 10, 8, and 7, perhaps. The youngest, my son Ben, he's the one sitting behind his sister on the horse, is the reason I included this little set of pictures. Here is Ben. Those were the years when boys grew their hair very long. And he's lying on top of his Newfoundland dog. The reason I've included this is because I remembered when thinking about books and kids, I remembered a day when Ben, about 8 years old, walked through the kitchen. I was always in the kitchen. And he looked immensely sad. And usually Ben was an exuberant, busy, always on the go. But now he plodded through the kitchen with a sad look on his face. And I said, Ben, what's wrong? And he said, page 161 of Charlotte's Web. This was the book he was reading. You've all read it. I've read it. We've all loved it. I may have the page number wrong after all these years, but the sentence he referred to and which he quoted for me was this: no one was with her when she died. E.B. White is himself long dead. He lived in Maine, up the coast from me. But I marveled at that time, and I do still, how a writer can come up with a sentence that speaks to the heart of a child, and also, at the same time, makes a child, a young child, an 8-year-old boy, understand what a profound sentence that is. This is a book that I wrote some years ago, of The Silent Boy, and it's also set in the early part of the 20th century. It concludes about the time of the First World War. It's the time of my mother's childhood, and I illustrated it with actual photographs, some from my own family, and that's why I've included this. This is a photograph of my mother. In the book, it's the child's 7th birthday. I don't actually know how old my mother was in this photograph. She was born in 1906. She looks to be about 7 years old. And here she is with her mother. This is my grandmother. My mother is the little girl, and that's my uncle on my grandmother's right. And my mother still with a huge hair ribbon. And the reason I've included this is because there they are with their mother reading to them. That was the history of my family. I was so fortunate to have been born into a family that valued books and stories, with mothers that read to their children. And my mother grew up to be that kind of mother as well. Here she's probably only 6 years old. Here she is as a young mother. And I couldn't find a picture of her reading to me, but this is my sister, who was 3 years older, my sister Helen. I can't quite see the title on the book, but the pose is very familiar. Mother with her arm around a small child and a book on her lap. My mother had been a kindergarten teacher before she married. She was a wonderful reader of stories. So this is what my childhood consisted of. And this is me, I'm the younger one with my sister. I'm 3 and she's 6. And she has started school now. And she's learning to read. And amazingly, she's teaching me. She came home every day and said, let's play school. I'll be the teacher. And she told me and showed me how the letters all had sounds, and the sounds went together to make words, and the words made sentences. And I lived in a house that was filled with familiar books because my mother had read them to me so often, and I could now pick up a book and I would know the words already because I'd heard them so often from my mother, and now I could identify them and figure out the sounds. And it didn't take very long until I could read myself. Though we can't see the title of this book, I'm pretty certain it's The Gingerbread Man because I can see that picture on the right-hand page. I can hear my sister's voice. And amazingly, I mean, maybe this is only amazing to me, but these old photographs, my father was a very good amateur photographer. He always had a dark room. So we have lots of old photographs. They're all black and white, of course. And yet when I look at them, I know exactly what color everything was. I can tell you the color of my sister's pajamas. I can tell you the color of that little wicker rocking chair. It was a kind of moss green. I've always been very acutely, I guess, aware of colors. So it was particularly difficult for me to write the book, The Giver, in which there's no color at all. At any rate, here I am with my sister, learning to read. This is a memoir that I wrote some years back. My sister and me at the place where we spent summers, our summer home in Pennsylvania, in the world's two ugliest bathing suits. Again, I can tell you not only the color of those bathing suits, but I can tell you how they smelled. I mean, not that they were particularly smelly bathing suits, but I can remember the feel of the fabric and the smell of the moistness of the fabric when we would come in after a long day at the lake. My sister died young, and the first book that I wrote for young people was fictionalized, but it was about the death of a teenage girl told from the point of view of the younger sister. These are just two of many covers that have been on this book. The one on the right is the one that still is out there. And amazingly, there's a passage in this book that again and again over the years, sadly, people have written to me and told me that they have read this passage aloud at the funeral or the memorial service of someone you love, someone they love. Gradually, the empty, silent parts of you fill up with sounds of talking and laughter again, and the jagged edges of sadness are softened by memories. Of course, that's an experience that most of us have had. Those of you who are young haven't yet, but you will. Because that's part of living, is the end of life. And so it always is very gratifying to me that these words that I wrote many years ago, this book was published in 1977, are still of comfort to some people sometimes. This is the hospital where I was born, Tripler Hospital, just outside of Honolulu. If you fly to Hawaii and land in Honolulu and take a taxi from the airport into the city, you will pass this very pink hospital on your left. It's quite a landmark. I was born there in 1937. My father was a career Army officer, and that's why we were, at that time, living in Honolulu. We actually lived outside of Honolulu and Waianae up in those hills. And that's why I was born there. Here I am, a year old, and there's my sister, and amazingly, I can tell you the exact colors in her dress. It was a kind of cream-colored dress with little pink rosebuds in it. And here we are again in the garden. And then, of course, as everybody knows, Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941. The war began, and my father, being in the military, eventually had to go overseas. When he left, my mother was expecting a baby. In those days, you didn't know what kind of baby you were going to have. It turned out to be my baby brother, John. And my mother took us back, my sister and me, back to Pennsylvania, where she had grown up. Here's my dad. He took that picture of himself. The camera was on a tripod, and then he went into his dark room and printed it. We went back to my mother's home in Pennsylvania and moved in with my grandparents. My mother says I complained and complained. I'd never been cold before. And that's where I began first grade in Pennsylvania. This was my very distinguished grandfather. He was a bank president, lovely man, and also a man who lived a life devoted to literature. There was a whole room in that house that was called the library, and indeed its walls were ceiling high with bookcases and leather-bound volumes. And Grandpa would read to me, and there was no, Mother would read to me from Winnie the Pooh and Mary Poppins, but Grandpa would read to me from Dickens and Rudyard Kipling. His house, the house I spent my early childhood in, is now the Landis house. My grandfather's last name was Landis. This is the house, and it's the little town is the home of Dickinson College. I wonder what my grandfather would think now that his house houses the Gender Violence Network and the LGBTQ services and the Women's and Gender Research Center. I'd like to think that he would be proud of that. I know that my brother and I went back to that little town one time, not too many years ago. It was summer and this building was closed, but we walked to what had been Grandpa's house. The house, I started to say, in which my brother was born, but actually, of course, he was born in a hospital, but Mother brought him home from the hospital to this house, and the first time I saw my brother was in this house. We went back there, and we went up on the porch and peered in the windows, and we had the reaction that most people do, returning to something from their past. It was smaller than we remembered, and of course, that's because we were small when we lived there. Here I am in probably the year that I began first grade. I loved school. I've always loved school. And there I am with my little brother who was born just before my 6th birthday. This is not a children's book. It was a book published for adults. It was a selection of the Book of the Month Club to which my mother subscribed. And for some reason, she knew that I would love this book, as she did. And she read it to me, a chapter a night when I was 8 years old. My sister, who would have been 11, and we had separate bedrooms, both opening onto the same hallway. Mother would sit in the hall reading aloud. Our rooms would be dark. We'd be in bed. And then after a little while, my sister said, I don't know if she said this word, whether it was in fashion then, but something like boring. And she closed her door and went back to Nancy Drew. And my mother and I read The Yearling together, a book that I have never forgotten. And our volume of it, which I still have, had the illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. I would, after Mother left and she would leave the book in my room, I would turn on my light and just look at a picture once again. This picture, as you can see, has a title below it, The Vigil. I didn't know what that meant, The Vigil. And so I turned to the page and I read the sentence. I should explain first that this is Jody, the boy with whom I identified. This is his father in the bed, and his father has been bitten by a rattlesnake and might be dying. And there's the doctor nodding off on the other side of the bed. And the vigil, what did that mean? I went to the page and it said the vigil was in his hands. I went back and looked at the picture again. It didn't look as if there was anything in his hands. Nonetheless, I propped my doll in my bed, and then I arranged myself, checking the picture now and again to make sure I got it right, in the exact same pose. And I took a little eraser from my desk and held it in my hand and thought, the vigil was in her hands. I don't know why I did that. It's just the way I was. I was kind of a nerd. And my sister would walk past my room and she would say, Mom, Lois is doing that weird thing by her bed again. But my mother would have understood. This was another book published for adults that came into my awareness at about that time when I was 10, actually. And I took this book from the public library. More about the library in a minute, because that's what I'm here to talk about, is libraries. But I had been to the library and somehow happened on this book, though it wasn't in the children's department. I took it home. I never exactly understood what the librarian did. In those days, the librarian was kind of austere. She sat behind a high desk. When I was little, and I started going to that library when I was 6, by now I was 10, so I was taller, but I used to have to stand on tiptoes and hand my books up to her. And then she would do something mysterious. She would thump her hand on the book twice, and somehow that magically made it mine. I realize now she had a rubber stamp that she was stamping the date. But at any rate, I would play library at home with my books and propping up my dolls to be my customers. And then I would take a book and do this with my hand and hand the book to my Raggedy Ann. At any rate, I took this book home with me. It was just a 2-block walk to Grandpa's house from the library in this small town. And by the time I got home, my mother met me at the door, and she said the librarian had called to tell her that I had taken out an inappropriate book. So I handed her the book, and she looked at it and smiled. She had read the book, which was a very popular book for adults at that time, and she gave it back to me. So that was my first experience, not my last, with attempted censorship. But you know, it didn't bother me. Instead, it gave me a feeling that I had throughout my few years of life in that town, the feeling that everybody in the town cared about me. If I walked down the main street, I didn't know, half the people that I passed knew my grandfather or my mother and smiled at me. So there I am in Pennsylvania and reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn for the first but not the last time. This was the library. It's still there today, but now a building to its side has been renovated and has become an expanded part of the library. It's become much more modern, but this was the library I remembered from my childhood. And I had always remembered it as having 100 marble steps. It was like walking into the Parthenon or something. My grandfather was a vestry member of the Episcopal Church, and I went dutifully to Sunday school every Sunday, but this was really my church. It took me by surprise when I went back to this town, because I had not been there since I was 14 years old. And went to the library again. Actually, I went there as an adult to make a speech, but when I went back the first time and saw the library again, my cathedral, I discovered it was only 12 cement steps. But somehow, to a little girl climbing those steps to return my books, and then coming back down with my arms filled with new ones, made it feel almost holy. That library had been in that town for many, many years, and my mother had gone to that library when she was a child. Looking through the history of it, I came across this when it was open, etc. Books could be borrowed for 2 weeks, 2 books at a time, provided they shall not both be fiction. Sounds as if there was something suspicious about fiction in those days. Patrons shall be persons above the age of 12 years of cleanly habits and good reputation. Such persons, if they were permanent residents of the town, including Dickinson College students, could get a library card for annual dues of $1. I have to assume that my mother was a person of good reputation and cleanly habits, and so was I when I got my library card at that library when I was 6 years old. The war, of course, ended in 1945. My father, though we knew he was in the Pacific, and as a child I had no idea what that meant, the Pacific, we never knew exactly where he was. It turned out my father was an oral surgeon, and he was on a hospital ship. the ship called Hope, treating facial and jaw injuries. And then, shortly before the war ended, he was on an island in the Pacific, and the island's name was Tinian. Later, that name would be known because it was the island on which they loaded the atomic bomb, which had been brought by ship, loaded it onto an airplane on that island, and flew it to Japan to end the war. But here is August 1945, and our lives will, of course, change because the war has ended. My father, though he came home for a visit, had to remain in Japan. He had to go back to Japan. He would be on the staff of the hospital in Tokyo. And after a little while, look how skinny I was. Look at those skinny arms. After a while, we were able to go there and join him. Now, though I was a voracious reader, I was not perhaps as discerning as I might have been. This was a book I had read in third grade. My third grade classroom had a series of these books written by the same person, and they were each about a pair of twins in a different country. And so I loved all of them. I read the Belgian twins and the Eskimo twins and the French twins, and I had loved the Japanese twins. And now I discovered I was going to be moving to Japan. And so the Japanese twins, though it was a book too young for me by this time, still had a particular interest to me because I thought it depicted the life that I would soon be living. Actually, I've gone back and looked at these books. Many books that you remember fondly from your childhood turn out, when you go back and re-look at them, not to have been that great. The Bobbsey twins are horrible books. However, these books about the twins from various countries are actually pretty well done. But they did misinform me, not the fault of the book, but I assumed that I would be wearing Japanese clothing, wearing those shoes that the children in the book, I didn't think I'd be carrying my baby brother on my back, but I thought I'd be eating rice with chopsticks and sleeping on the floor in a Japanese style house. None of that, of course, proved to be true. This is an American newspaper in Japan in 1945. I wasn't there yet, but you can see that there was a lot of damage. Tokyo was badly bombed and burned. And it was, by the time I was there after the war, a city that needed to be put back together. And that was the role of the American occupation. However, they had thrown up, that's a bad phrase to use, they had hastily constructed a small compound of American-style houses, and this was where we were to live. Not at all what I had expected. I sort of, I wanted a Japanese house with sliding doors. Instead, these were quite ugly cement houses. They're all gone now, incidentally. I've been back to Japan in recent years, and this area is all redone. But this is where I lived, and I went by bus every day to an international school in Tokyo. Also, my father, when he picked us up at the ship, these are our two maids, Ritsuko and Terako-san, and that's me in between. I'm 11 or 12 years old. My father met our ship in Yokohama. We sailed from New York, went down through the Panama Canal up to San Francisco and across to Japan. And he met our ship in Yokohama and drove us to Tokyo, to our home. And on the way, he whispered to me that he had a surprise for me. And it was a bicycle. That bicycle gave me such freedom. And Tokyo was a very safe place to be. And for an 11-year-old girl to be riding around the streets of a bombed-out city sounds a little dangerous or exciting. It wasn't. I mean, it was exciting, certainly, because it was a life unlike anything I'd seen before, a different culture, but it was completely safe, and I never felt frightened. You can see from the wreath on the door, this was Christmas, and I suppose they had dressed me up in Japanese clothing for a special occasion. Of course, I wore American clothing to school, and and we didn't really take up a Japanese style life, though in retrospect, I wish we could have. This is my little brother, John. He's now a retired doctor. And May 5th in Japan is Boys' Day. And I've forgotten which day is Girls' Day. It's in March, I believe. But at any rate, on Boys' Day, families hang a fish for each son. And so you will see Japanese houses, and this is true still, even in a sophisticated city like Tokyo. A family will hang, if they have 3 sons, there will be 3 fish flying. We had only Johnny, and so we had 1 fish. And there's my bicycle, and I will tell you more about that a little later. This is the part of the city where I rode my bike, but this is after I was there. I'm looking at the cars and realizing they're later than 1940s cars. This was much more primitive at the time. There were lots of outdoor stalls, people selling things. It was noisy and colorful and smelly, and there were oxen pulling carts of fertilizer, and people did have babies on their backs, and there was me on my bicycle. And then I found in Tokyo the Ernie Pyle building. Ernie Pyle had been a war correspondent. He was killed, I believe, the last week of the war. He was greatly loved American journalist. And this building was named for him, and it housed a library. It also had a movie theater in it, but the library was what meant everything to me. And in that library, I found all my old friends. Tree Grows in Brooklyn, The Yearling, they were all there, plus a whole world of new books, because I was getting older. I was 11, 12, 13, and I was beginning to read much more sophisticated books, and they were all there for me in that American library in downtown Tokyo. I'm jumping way ahead now, because I'm 83 years old. I can't take you through my whole life. But I went to college, I majored in writing, I dropped out, I married, I had children, and eventually I ended up in Maine, and this is my summer home. It's not the house where I'm speaking to you from right now. But I took this picture just a couple weeks ago when the daffodils were in bloom, and it's one of the places I love most in this world. And this is one of my children. This is my second child, my son Gray, who majored in economics in college and then entered the Air Force and became a fighter pilot. And he met and married, when he was stationed in Germany, a beautiful German woman named Margaret, who is still my greatly loved daughter-in-law. And they had my only granddaughter, who is there as an infant. My son, sadly, was killed in the military. And so my daughter-in-law stayed with her little girl in Germany near her parents, and I go there every year to visit. And that's why I included the picture of the farm. They've come, Margaret and her daughter, every summer to visit me at the farm. This is my granddaughter herself learning to read. She speaks now 5 languages, but she learned to read first in German and then in English. And she's an avid reader, as you can see. I think she's 10 in that picture. This, again, is the farm. And here is my granddaughter, probably 9 years old on the left. And this particular summer, she brought her best friend from Germany. Annika didn't speak any English at the time, but she managed. And then again, they came, my granddaughter came every summer, but Annika came back 2 years later, 3 years later, when they were both 13. Here they are. And the reason I've included this is because one day, I made them book covers. This is my granddaughter. I created a fake novel for her. And here is Annika's. She was very proud to take that back to Germany with her. At any rate, one day, the 2 girls went with me. This is in a small town in western Maine, little village. And they went with me to the library. I was just going to return some books. And while I was doing that, they wandered around. And downstairs in the children's department, there was a woman who used to come, maybe she still does, with a golden retriever. And she would have the small children read to the golden retriever. And there was also a room full of computers, because this is an area of Maine where a lot of tourists come. And they would stop into the library to get their email. And so a lot of stuff was going on. It was no longer the library of my childhood where one had to tiptoe and speak very softly. There was plenty of noise and conversation and excitement. And when we left, the girls said to me, or Annika whispered something to my granddaughter, who then said to me, Annika wants to know how much it costs to belong to the library. And I said, it doesn't cost anything. And they were astonished. They couldn't believe it. You don't have to pay anything? No, I said, every town has a library and anybody can go and use it. And they always have a children's room and they have story time and all of that. And so we were in the car by now. And instead of going back to my farmhouse, which is probably 2 miles from the library, this is the library where we were in Bridgeton, Maine. I said, let's take a little side trip here. And I took them to North Bridgeton, to the library, which is just it was in a house. And sadly, I think I've heard that it's had to close down, which is so sad. But then I took them to Waterford, Maine, which is just up the road. And that's their library. And the girls couldn't get over that. And I said to them, don't you have libraries in Germany? And I'm just going on to show you that they've grown up. They said, well, not in their little village, but if they wanted to go to the library, if they needed to go to the library, they would have to go to Bitburg by bus. And they would have to be dressed up. And it was kind of scary, they said, to go to the library. Not at all like what they found in this country. So here is Annika, who is now, even though she's very beautiful, we'll forgive her that because she also has a master's degree and she's also very brilliant. And here is my granddaughter, also grown up, and she's just gotten her master's degree and she is a teacher of languages. So that's my little story about libraries in rural Maine. The town where I now am speaking to you from is Falmouth, Maine, a suburb of Portland. And our library here is undergoing a wonderful renovation. It's gotten stalled a bit because of the pandemic, but it will be opening this spring. It's the same library that I took my children to when they were little. This is the new book on the horizon, which I wanted to tell you about. And it's always hard to know how to begin discussing this book. It's in 3 parts. I mentioned that I was born in Honolulu. My grandmother came from Wisconsin when I was born. I don't know if she arrived before I was born or after, but there she is with flowers around her neck. My grandmother visited, it says. She had come by train across the broad land from her home in Wisconsin and then by ship. We met her and heaped wreaths of plumeria around her neck. Aloha, we said to her. Welcome. Hello. I called her Nani. She took me down by the ocean. The sea moved in a blue-green rhythm, soft against the sand. We played there, she and I, with a small shovel and laughed when the breeze caught my bonnet and lifted it from my blonde hair. We played and giggled, calm, serene. And there behind us, slow, unseen, Arizona, great gray tomb, moved majestic toward her doom. Now I have to explain that. My father had a very good movie camera. Nowadays, of course, everybody can take movies with their iPhone. But in those days, things were much more primitive and complicated. And Dad had a very good movie camera. And so we had a lot of home movies. In those days, of course, there was no television. And it was always fun when in the evening, we would convince Dad to get out the projector and Mother would put the screen up and she would pull the curtains closed. And Dad would show the home movies of my sister and me as babies. Poor brother, he never got any home movies because he was born when Daddy was overseas. But there were my sister and me playing. Wonderful scene of she and I barefoot in the garden in Honolulu, watering mother's flowers with a big watering can. Funny scene of my sister in a clown costume at Halloween. She's probably 4 years old. But there's a scene of me on the beach with my grandmother, who lived with us for our time in Hawaii. She was disappointed when we left there and she went back to Wisconsin. She loved it there. So, and there's a scene of her and me on the beach at Waikiki in those days when there were no tourists there. And so it's just a lovely scene of a child playing and her grandmother watching her. And the water is lapping at the beach. And I had seen that scene on the beach many, many times. And when my father got old, I was visiting him once. I used to fly down from Boston where I lived. He was in Virginia in an assisted living place. And he told me that the old movies had begun to deteriorate and he probably should just have me throw them away. And he told me where they were in the garage of his house. But I went and looked at them and they were in big tin reels. And they did smell terrible because the film was starting to deteriorate. But I took them back with me to Boston and I found somebody he couldn't save all of it, but he saved a lot of it and put it onto videotape. And those were the early days of videotape. I had just bought a VCR. And so I brought these videotapes back to my apartment in Boston. And I was going to send them to my father. But before I did, I put them into my brand new VCR. And I had company there for dinner, several friends. And so I made them all watch the movies of Little Lois on the beach. And so we saw that scene and everybody said, "Ah," because it was very sweet. And then it moved on to the next scene of my sister and me with the big watering can in the garden. But one of my guests said, "Wait a minute, do you know how to stop it? And can you rewind it?" And I figured all that out. And he said, "I want to see the scene on the beach again." This was my friend John Devereaux, who was a lawyer in Boston, but he had actually gone to Annapolis. And then he had been for many years a naval officer, captain of a nuclear submarine, until he retired and then went to law school and became a lawyer. But he had a history in the Navy. And so he wanted to see the scene on Waikiki again. And so I played it one more time. This is just a still photograph taken from that film. And John looked at that and he said, "Look in the background." Of course, I'd only looked at myself. And at my grandmother. And he said, "That's the Arizona." He recognized the silhouette of the ship, the Arizona. And of course, once he said that, everybody in the room, kind of a hush fell. It gave a whole chilling meaning to that scene because there's the child, me, laughing and playing on the beach in the sunshine. And there in the background was a ship which carried 1,200 men, most of them very young, and who, within a very few months, would all be dead. And I began to be haunted by that, but I didn't know quite what to do with it. I've now figured out and have done it. I've done the research on who those young men were. There were, for example, 37 pairs of brothers on that ship. One pair of identical twins. They came from all over the United States. Many of them had joined the Navy because they were poor. They came from poor families. They came out of the Depression and they came from farms. There was one young man who wanted very much to be a doctor, but he was the youngest of, I think I remember, 12 children. And there was no way he could go on for higher education. So he joined the Navy and they made him a pharmacist's mate, as close as he could get to medicine. Every young man on that ship had a life and had a story. And so I had to select the ones that I would tell. And I did that kind of intuitively, and I'll tell you in a little bit about one and why I selected him. But at any rate, that was the Arizona. And that became the first third of the book, On the Horizon. And it was because of what my friend John said that night. He said, look on the horizon. The second part of the book takes place 4 years later in August of 1945. And it begins again. I used individuals and how they were affected by events. When my family moved to Japan, we lived in Tokyo. And you can see where Tokyo is there, right in the center of Japan on the East Coast. And there, if you look farther southwest toward Korea, you'll see Hiroshima there on the inland sea. And that's just to give you a sense of where things were. You see Hiroshima there at the top. We're now down in southern Japan. And there is an island in the inland sea called Itajima. Jima means island. And that's where I spent summers, on that island. More about that in a moment. This is the inland sea. I've been back there fairly recently. It's, as you all know from Japanese paintings and from photographs, it's an incredibly beautiful part of the world with these islands rising up out of the sea, many of them uninhabited. And now you can see there's Hiroshima at the top. There's Itajima, where I spent summers. And now look down to the left, where there's a little purple marker, which I placed there by computer. And that's a little town called Tabuse. And that was the child, a child who lived there is the child with whom I began part 2 of the book. And I have heard this story from him personally. In a small town called Tabuse, on August 5th, a summer day, a little boy, Koichi Sei, felt a shudder in the earth and saw the sky change. From Hiroshima, miles away, beyond the hills, beside the bay, on August 5th, a summer day, Koichi-san perceived the birth of something strange. Is this how it ends? The world this way? On August 5th, a summer day? Morning light, a boy at play. It could, it might, it may. He was a real child. He was 8 years old that morning. More about him in a minute. This is what happened that day to Hiroshima. His town was 50 miles away, but he could feel the earth shift and he could see the light in the sky when the bomb was dropped. If you look down here on the right, there's one building badly damaged but still standing, and that stands there still. It's part of the Peace Memorial, and they've left it there as a memorial to that day. But the city was destroyed. This is the city of that building as it looks today. In part 2, I did various short pieces about individuals, most of them young, who were there that day on August 6, 1945. And also there's a piece about the men in the plane that carried the bomb from the island where, though I didn't know it then, where my father was. And the third section takes place in Tokyo after the war has ended. Koichi Sei and his mother and sister, after the bomb was dropped, moved north to Tokyo. And I, with my sister and brother and mother, moved to Tokyo as well at about the same time. And I had this bicycle. I used to ride my bike around the streets of Tokyo, near where I lived, not downtown Tokyo, but in the area where I lived. And I used to stop my bike and watch children playing on a playground of a Japanese school. And one of them was this little boy. He would stare at me and I at him, but we never spoke to each other. We had been enemies, of course, and we were still strangers. Our languages were different. My hair was blonde, his was dark, and yet we were curious and stared, but never spoke. Beside a school, I paused one day and watched some children run and play. We were curious, I know that's true. Their eyes were dark and mine were blue. I braked my bike and watched them there. I saw them eye my pale blonde hair. They looked at me and I at them. So why were we so silent, mute and shy? I smiled before I rode away, but never met Koichi Sei until so many years went by that he was gray-haired, so was I. I'd lived in his country then, and now he'd moved to mine. So when we met, his name was Alan now, we mused and pondered how from our horizons we had viewed a war begin, a war conclude. We were young, we were alike, boy in a schoolyard, girl on a bike. I'll come back to Koichi Sei, but because of something that's just happened, I've included this as well. This was in the first Pearl Harbor section. This was one of the young men that I chose to write about. James Myers. James was from Missouri and had two brothers. The older boy had died in France in World War I. The youngest, out in a field bringing the cows when a storm struck, was killed by lightning. He was 15. So James was left. He'd married and had two sons himself, but his wife died young, and the little boys, Jimmy and Gordon, went to live with their grandma in Seattle. It was the other grandma, widowed Mary Myers in Missouri, who opened the telegram with dread. I had bad luck with all my boys, she said. I mentioned how hard it was to choose which of those 1,100 and some young men to write about, because each had a story, each had a life history. And this one was nobody special, really. None of them were unusual in any way. But this one caught my attention as I read his brief biography and then clicked on this, clicked on that, found my way down to an old newspaper where there was an interview with Mary Myers in Missouri. And it was that she said, I had bad luck with all my boys. That was so chilling to me. So that's the wrong word. It was so stark, so stoic. What had happened to this woman? All of her sons now were gone. The third son died at Pearl Harbor. I had bad luck with all my boys. And so I couldn't not put James Myers in. And look at this. This just came, you can see the date, May 23rd, just 2 weeks ago. Dear Miss Lowry, James Myers was my father. And those boys are my brother Jimmy and myself. There were many lives lost on the Arizona when Pearl Harbor was attacked. I'm wondering why you chose to write about my father. And what are the odds that my friend would find your book? I'm sorry, I can't read the next words because something's covering it. But at any rate, I too made a career in the Navy, spent many tours in Japan and Hawaii. Gordon Myers. It's an amazing, maybe it's not that amazing because so often this happens. Things circle around and connect. And that's what I tried to make this book be about the connections we have to each other. Of course, I've written back to Gordon Myers in Kirkland, Washington. This is the Arizona Memorial, which stands on top of the ship, which is still underwater there. You can look down and see it. The men who died on that ship are still entombed there. And if you had a magnifying glass, you would be able to find the name of James Myers on this wall. And this is the museum in Hiroshima, where so many others died 4 years later. And this is the book. And here is Koichi Sei, gray-haired now with his wife. And I mentioned in the piece I wrote about him in the book, his name is Alan now. When he moved to the United States, where he now lives, he took an American name, and his name is Alan Say. He's a very highly regarded, well-known illustrator, and this is a beautiful book called Grandfather's Journey, which won the Caldecott Medal the same year my book, The Giver, won the Newbery Medal, and that's when Alan and I met. He gave me a copy of this book, signed his name, and I gave him a copy of mine, signed my name in Japanese. And he looked at it and laughed and said, "How come you can do that?" And I said, "Well, I lived in Japan when I was a kid." "Where did you live?" he said. And turns out we're exactly the same age, born the same year. And I told him where I lived, what part of Tokyo. He said, "That's where I lived." And we continued in that vein until suddenly Alan said, "Were you the girl on the green bicycle?" And that's, again, the way things circle back and connect to each other. This was last August. I was out in Oregon where Alan and Mickey live, and we once again got together. He's become a very close friend. And recently, he wrote to me, and he was speaking of the pandemic, which has, of course, affected all of us. My husband's in the hospital now as I speak. And Alan said in his email, "We're in a new kind of war, and this time we're on the same side." I was going to stop there, and I will stop shortly, but I added something else to this just this afternoon, which because of what's happening now in this country, suddenly this came to my mind, so I'm just going to go on for 4 more pictures here. This is Ben. I've showed you Ben before with his Newfoundland dog. In looking at this picture and remembering Ben at that age. And then I came across this picture, which is Ben's son, Reese, sort of the same age. I think Reese is 5 or 6 here, reading a book by his grandma. And I suddenly remembered another little boy. In the summer when Ben was when he was 6 years old, just finished first grade, we took a fresh air child for 2 weeks in the summer. He was a little boy from a housing project in the Bronx in New York. And he was also 6 years old, and his name was Anthony. And he came every summer to us for several years. And then a summer came when I sent in the application, and there was no response, and they couldn't find his mother. I don't think there was a father. And he had simply disappeared, and we never saw him again. But a few years ago, in 2004, actually it was 2003 that I was asked to do this, there was a book being put together to honor the 50th anniversary of Board versus, Linda Brown versus Board of Education. 50 years had passed, and they asked me if I would write a piece for this, and I tried to think of what to write, and I remembered Anthony. And so I wrote about Anthony, and the illustrator did this beautiful picture that even looks like him, and I love that in the picture he's holding a book. But the thing that I wrote about was the fact that every night the kids would gather, and I would read to them on the couch in the evenings. Anthony loved that part of the day more than any other. And it says here, night after night, I'm reading from the book now, for 3 summers we sat on that yellow couch, the Newfoundland snoring at our feet, and journeyed through books. The cool barn where Charlotte lived and died, the primordial swamp where dinosaurs roamed, space and rocket ships, Oz and Narnia, all of them became the landscape of Anthony's life and our family. Each August, he went home with books in his suitcase, stories in his heart, and the expectation that this year would be the year when he would learn to read. And yet, he never did. I'm not quoting from the piece now. I'm just saying, year after year, he came back and he still couldn't read. He was a bright kid, and he was hardworking, and he wanted so badly to read. And the 2 weeks he spent with me, he didn't want to spend time being instructed. So he said, no, I'll learn when I'm back in school. And yet he never did. I'm quoting again from this piece, and it says, he can't read a single word, Mom, Ben confided privately, not even green eggs and ham, and he's going into 4th grade. So toward the end of this piece, it says this: what does any of this have to do with Brown versus Board of Education? That decision handed down 14 years before a child named Anthony entered my kitchen carrying a little plastic suitcase. I'm not at all sure. Sadly, it's a reminder that the Supreme Court of the United States could not decree an end to every problem that an African-American child, heart-filled with hope, would face in today's world. The court couldn't mandate caring classrooms of fine teachers with a reverence for literacy, but it gave children like Anthony the right to expect those things, to hope for them, to demand them. My son Ben is a lawyer now, and he has 2 little boys of his own. Every night they curl up beside him wearing their Spider-Man pajamas and listen to the stories he reads. From time to time, I think about Anthony and wonder where he is. Statistics tell me that a little black boy growing up 30 years ago in a Bronx project had a pretty good chance of becoming a dropout, a drug addict, a criminal, or a corpse. But I don't think those things happened to Anthony. I think that in his case, the statistics were offset by other things, that he had a mother who ironed his pajamas, that at 6 years old, he had carried his own suitcase into the home of strangers and made himself a place, that he cherished books and was determined to master reading no matter how long it took. I think that tonight, this very night, somewhere he is holding his own child on his lap and reading a story aloud. So that's where I'm going to stop. We still have a lot to do in this world, in this nation, but libraries and books are always going to play a big role in our doing that. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much,
back.
Lois. Yeah, thank you.
You're
That was
welcome.
amazing. So, I mean, somebody wrote that they had chills from that once you revealed that that was Alan Say, who's absolutely one of my favorite writers. I do want to say that there's a couple of comments that I wanted to read to you from Kim, who wrote that Margaret and Jürgen and Nadine were our neighbors when we were stationed in Germany, and Margaret introduced us to your writing.
Oh.
And
can that person tell me her name so I can tell Margaret?
Kim? Oh, well, I'll tell Kim. Is that okay if I tell your name in public? Kim Nudi, N-U-D-I. And then we have a comment from a 10-year-old who said, I read Number of the Stars last year and it was really good. I read it again this year and it was even better. So
Great to reread a favorite.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions. Let's see. When did you write the Willoughbys?
When did I write the Willoughbys? Oh, that is a good question, which I don't have an answer to, but probably 10 years ago. Okay. And it had a different cover when it was first published, and now they've put a new, more appealing cover on it.
I actually love the Willoughbys, and I love the original cover, so. How do you write your stories? What's your process?
That's the whole question.
The big one.
Well, I sit at my computer and I make a document and I give it a title. There's no easy answer for that. I always start out a book with a character who has appeared in my imagination. And then I place that character in a place where something is slightly not quite right. And if you think back to most books, that's how they begin. If you think to The Giver, Jonas is on his bicycle, and it says in the first sentence, he was beginning to be scared. Maybe it says frightened, I don't remember. But every book begins with a character, and the author tries to make you care about the character and then to worry about the character, because that character has to achieve something, has something he or she needs or wants, and something's keeping him or her from getting it. And so then the book proceeds from there, and the author dreams up lots of obstacles for the characters. Otherwise, the book would end in the second chapter. You got to keep it going.
We are live streaming on Facebook, and all of your Facebook fans are just giving you a shout out about how awesome you are. So next question, where in Pennsylvania did you summer as a child?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Where in Pennsylvania did you summer as a child?
Oh, did I summer? I lived in the town of Carlisle, which is sort of between Harrisburg and Gettysburg. And my summer home was in a state, I think it was a state park, although you couldn't have had homes there. I don't know, it was a historic area. And my grandmother had bought an old flour mill, which was made of stone, and she remodeled it into a house. It was a wonderful house, and now the state of Pennsylvania owns that house, and I believe it's the headquarters for what is now State Park. But that area was called Pine Grove, I think National Forest.
Okay. What was your favorite book to write?
Oh boy, that's hard to answer. My favorite one is always the one I'm working on. And I'm just starting a new one now, but I'm not talking about it because I find if I talk about a book, it disappears from my imagination. And so I never talk about them until I'm done. But right now, my favorite one is the one that I've written about 20 pages of.
What did you intend the recurring sled to symbolize and the giver to mean? And was there a reason it was mentioned 3 times?
You know, could you repeat that? I'm for some reason having a little difficulty hearing you.
Sure. What did you intend the recurring sled to symbolize and the giver to mean? And was there a reason it was mentioned 3 times?
The sled was mentioned 3 times?
Yes.
I have no idea. You know, I think teachers do a great job of teaching about literary devices, including symbols. But when I'm writing something, I don't think this is a symbol. What is it a symbol of? And I'm going to put it in here 3 times. I just tell a story, and then I can look back on it. I can reread it after it's done and published, and I've thought about it for a while, and I can say to myself, oh, I guess the sled is a symbol. But I didn't think that when I was writing it, so I can't say what it's a symbol of. But I will tell you that in a book of mine written many years ago, one of my own favorites called Autumn Street, there is also a sled which plays a very important role in the book. So perhaps in my own subconscious, there's something about sleds. I mentioned that my husband's in the hospital. Too bad we can't call him up because he's a retired psychiatrist, and maybe we could ask him about symbolism and sleds. But I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
How long did you live in Japan for?
3 years.
3 years? Okay. I am a 4th grade teacher in Lexington, and it is such a pleasure and privilege to hear you speak about books and your passion for literature. We've studied Number of the Stars as part of our work in historical fiction, and my 4th graders and I adore your books and are big fans of your work. What advice do you have for young writers?
I wish there were some little practical piece of advice that I could give out. I've heard Steve King say this too. You know, that there's a particular store you can go to on Route 18 and you can buy ideas, and there's a particular pencil you can buy there. But the truth is there's no really one piece of advice except the very broad one, which is people who want to be writers are already doing what they should be doing. And one of those things is reading. because you learn to write from reading, and you should also be writing. Those are the things I did from the time of my earliest childhood. And I'm just remembering that when I was a child, I subscribed to a children's magazine that existed then, and every month they printed letters from children, and I wrote to them again and again, and they never published my letters until I was 10 years old. They finally published a letter from me to them, and I remembered that had happened and how excited I was to see my letter in a magazine, but I'd forgotten what the letter said. And then somebody doing graduate work, doing research on me, sent me a copy of that magazine and that letter, which was published in August 1947 when I was 10 years old. And in the letter, it said, "I am writing a book called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13. Well, I have no memory of that. But I don't think it was a lie. I was always writing a book. I'm still very mad at my brother, who is in his 70s now, but he does not remember the book that I wrote for him when he was 3 years old. It was called Skizix, the Magic Airplane. If he was 3, I was 9. So I mention all of those things only to point out that I was always, as a kid, writing. I wasn't writing things worth publishing, but I was learning to write better. Every time I started something new, it would be a little better than the last one. And I was always reading.
What inspired you to write The Giver? Thank you, Jamie and Lindsay.
My imagination. That's all.
Wow, that's quite an imagination.
You know, when you think about anything, and then you insert the phrase "what if," a story begins to take shape. And I was probably thinking, what if we could manipulate human memory? What if we could do away with the past? And then a story began to take shape. That's the best I can describe.
Okay. Lena would like to know, how has technology changed your work?
Oh, wow. Technology has been wonderful for me. My father gave me, for my 13th birthday, gave me a typewriter. It was a remarkable gift because in those days, I mean, nowadays, every kid who's 10 years old has a computer. But back in the 1940s, let's see, I turned 13 in 1950. Kids didn't have typewriters. And my father gave me a typewriter. And that's the typewriter I took with me to college. Eventually, I replaced it with an electric typewriter, but in the beginning, it was a manual typewriter. And so it was hard writing both that and then with an electric typewriter. You still had to, I mean, kids today don't know about this. You had to roll individual pieces of paper into the typewriter, and then you typed that page and took it out and put in a new page. And if you made a mistake, or if you wanted to change something, you had to retype the whole page. So as soon as computers, well, not as soon as, but when I first got a computer, it made my life so much easier. It made it made my books better too, I think, because in the early days, I probably should have done revisions that I didn't do because I didn't want to retype 180 pages. And then with a computer, I could revise and revise and revise, and it became hard to know when to stop. That became the difficult part. At some point, you just had to say enough and type the end. My first, what I thought was a computer, really wasn't. It was a dedicated word processor. I thought, oh, now I have a computer, but it wasn't at all. It was, I guess, what was called a dedicated word processor. And the printer was very noisy, and the pages, the sheets came out all attached to each other, and you had to tear them apart. Probably some of you watching are old enough to remember those days. And then I went from there to an actual computer. And the first book that I wrote on a computer an Apple computer was, I believe, The Giver. And that would have been 1991 or 2.
Okay, thank you. If you hadn't become a writer, what profession would you have chosen?
I would have been a filmmaker. I love film. I love movies. I studied photography in graduate school, and I worked as a photographer. I did the photograph on the cover of The Giver. I did the photograph on the cover of Number of the Stars. And I love visual stuff of that sort, and manipulation of visuals. I don't know if any of you remember the author Richard Peck, wonderful author. He and I were together once at a conference, and we were in the same hotel, and I was having breakfast when he came in and joined me at breakfast, and we got talking, and he said, if you weren't a writer, what would you like to be? And I went through that. I said filmmaking, and he said, what aspect of filmmaking? And I said, well, I'd like to write the script, of course, a screenplay. I'd like to do the casting, design the costumes, the set, and I'd like to direct, and I'd like to be the cinematographer as well. And he said, you already do all that. And it's true. I do that sitting at my computer writing a book. I write the screenplay, of course. I write the dialogue. I design the costumes. I create the setting. I choose the cast. So I do all of that just in a different way. But if I were young now, this didn't exist when I was going to school, I would have studied filmmaking, I think.
Okay. I'm going to allow Kate Dennehy to ask a question. Kate?
Well, I'm trying to redo books, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations.
Recommendation for a book for you to read?
Yeah.
Do you mean a book by me or by somebody else?
It can be by you, it can be by anyone.
And I don't know enough about you to recommend a book for you. Tell me how old you are.
I'm 11.
Okay. And what kinds of things are you interested in? What kinds of books do you like?
Well, I like a lot of fictions of books. I like fantasy. I like historical fiction. It kind of depends on what it's about.
Yeah, that's hard. But, 11-year-old girl, probably almost any one of my books would be suitable for you, except I have done one series for younger kids, Goonie Bird Green. There's 7 or 8 of those. But I've done a lot that are for your age, and most of them have female main characters. And I bet any one of them would be suitable for you. I don't actually read children's books, and so I can't recommend some by other people because I haven't read them, but there are an awful lot of good books out there, and I bet anything your library has a children's librarian who knows them all.
That is very true. Definitely talk to Alyssa if you get a chance. Okay. How did you take the leap from mothering 4 young children and taking up your pen and writing your first book? Very courageous. And did you write well into the night after everyone was in bed?
I mentioned earlier that I had dropped out of college at the end of my sophomore year. So when my youngest son, Ben, went to kindergarten, I went back to college. And it took me 4 years to complete the 2 years I needed to get my bachelor's degree. And then I went to graduate school. So there was a number of years when my kids were young, when I was doing schoolwork, and we all did our homework together in the evenings. It was when I was in graduate school that I began writing on the side. And I never completed my master's degree because I began selling things that I was writing, and suddenly my master's thesis didn't seem that interesting anymore. But I wasn't writing books. I was writing articles and short stories. And then I've forgotten how old I was, but say my late 30s, I published a short story in a magazine, which, although it was a story for adults, was seen through the eyes of a child. And a children's book editor read it and wrote me a letter. and said, "You sound like somebody who could write for young people. Would you consider writing a book for our publishing company?" So with that invitation, I wrote my first book. They didn't promise to publish it, of course, until I wrote it and they read it to see if they liked it. But they did publish it, and that was my first book. And that publisher has published almost all of my books since then. I've done a few with other publishers, but Houghton Mifflin has done most of my books.
We have a question from a 4th grader on Facebook. What motivates you to write?
Well, it's the thing I most enjoy doing in the world. Also, it's my job. I make my living doing it. But I think even if I didn't have to make a living, I would probably do it anyway, just because I enjoy doing it so much.
So do what you love. Also a question from Facebook. Is your mind always rolling for ideas? I'm a big fan, and from your story, I'm intrigued if you will ever write a biography.
I couldn't hear the second half of your question. About a biography?
Will you ever write a biography?
You don't mean an autobiography, a biography of somebody else? Probably not, although I do enjoy reading them. Now, I've forgotten the first part of the question. Is my mind always... I have so many ideas in my head all the time that it's hard to sort them out and focus in on one. And I like doing different kinds of books. I mean, the Willoughbys are humorous books. The one I mentioned, like the Willow Tree, the one set during the flu epidemic, that's historic fiction. Number of the Stars is historic fiction, and those require research. I enjoy doing that. I don't like science fiction, and so probably I would never try to do that. I don't think I'd be any good at it. I don't think of the Giver Quartet as science fiction. There's a fantasy element to it, but there's no science involved.
We have 2 people asking, what was the first book you wrote?
The first book I wrote was called A Summer to Die, and it was fiction, but it was based on the death of my own sister when we were young. And the main character is a 13-year-old girl, and it's about the effect on the whole family when her 15-year-old sister dies. So it's a sad book.
We have 3 questions about book recommendations, especially about social justice, because of the things going on right now, for like that middle grade age, especially.
Is there a specific question, or are they looking for book recommendations?
Book recommendations.
Yeah, that's a question that has to go to the librarian. I'm just simply not an expert in that. I don't know enough.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask one last question. It's from Effie, and she said, I read in Looking Back, a book of memories, that Bucky resides in your office. Is he still there? And does he help you write?
Bucky is a human skeleton, which was given to my grandson for his 13th birthday by my brother, who is a doctor. And I don't know, my grandson is now 21, and he's lost interest in Bucky. But somehow Bucky ended up in my office at the farm. And there is a lot of room there, so Bucky isn't taking up anybody's space. He sometimes gets a new hat. He usually wears a baseball hat. And he sits in a chair with his legs crossed. I did use him I mentioned the Goonie Bird Green series, which is for younger kids. It's all set in a 2nd grade classroom. And each month of the year, there is a book about the 2nd grade classroom. And in each month, they take up a different subject. One book is the class learns to write poetry. And in the book in which they study the human body, Bucky was a great help in writing that book. I only had to look across the room to him. And there is a skeleton involved in that book. It gets stolen at the end. Put it in a little mystery there.
Well, thank you so much, Lois. This is fantastic, so fascinating, your whole history. the reasons you write books, how you get your ideas. It's just wonderful.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me to be here. I don't know if you could hear my phone ringing in the background. I should have turned it off. I'll have to go find out who was trying to reach me. But thank you all. It's been a nice way to spend an evening with you.
I will share everybody's comments with you because there's some really lovely ones. And Effie and I and everybody at the Cary Library, thank you for your time and your books and for being an inspiration to so many of us. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.